Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you. Good morning again. Thanks for coming. Again, I'm Dennis Sikowski. I'm the science director here at the Hudson River Foundation, and I want to welcome everyone. We've got a great seminar today. John Waldman has returned. Our prodigal son has come back to the Hudson River Foundation. We've got a nice turnout here in the office. We have about 30 people, just so you folks on the webinar know that. We should have about 50 people on the webinar, so it's a popular topic. A couple of housekeeping details. We appreciate you folks calling in ahead of time so we can plan sort of numbers of seats and so forth. We're just going to pass around this sheet that if you signed in, if you could just check that you're here. If you just came in and we don't have an email address for you, please fill it out. Greatly appreciated. I just want to mention that we have one more seminar this spring, which will take place on May 19th, and it's going to be about PCBs. Jay Field from NOAA is going to talk about PCBs and striped bass, so I hope to see you then. Today we're going to talk about fish, or John is going to talk about fish. I think a lot of you know John Waldman. And I had the personal pleasure of working with John for, I guess, over 20 years. John was here at the foundation. He left. We didn't fire him. He left on his own to greener pastures at Queens College. John is one of the more interesting people that I know. Not only is he really smart, but he's a terrific angler. And when he goes out fishing, he actually catches things. He actually catches things just about every time he goes out. It's really absolutely remarkable. So, John is a terrific scientist and has a lot of passions. He's got a lot of passions about this particular estuary. He's a terrific writer. If you pay attention to the Times, John's got articles in the Times. He has several books that are out. I mean, certainly Heartbeats in the Muck is a must-read for anybody that's interested in this particular estuary. John has a lot of interests. He's in particular areas of the estuary. John's been working on Jamaica Bay. He's one of the founders of the new resiliency center that's starting up in Jamaica Bay. He's had an interest in stock identification and population genetics. Done a lot of work over the years on stock IDs on a number of stocks of anadromous fish. He's interested in restoration. We're going to hear a bit about restoration today. He's got a keen interest in the Bronx River, working with some of his students, and I'm proud to say that John and his colleagues have a Hudson River Foundation grant to do some more eel restoration work on the Bronx River. So we're glad to have you back, Dr. Waldman. Podium is yours.
Well, thank you, Dennis. Great to be back among a lot of friends. Thanks for turning out today. And I chose this title, and I've had some comments about it, the fact that I use this word repair instead of just restore. And I chose that on purpose. I think we're not going to restore diadromous fishes until we actually repair rivers, and I mean that in a literal sense. Our rivers have basically gone to hell. And I chose this image because if the screens were up, this is Robbins Reef out in New York Harbor, which you can see from this window. This was the 1800s when you could still catch shad in this river. This river used to be a fantastic shad producer. In 1889, there were 4 million pounds of shad harvested in the Hudson River. In 2015, there will not be a single fish legally taken by commercial or recreational angling. That's how far we declined. And that's kind of the mood of this talk, I'm sorry to say. It's mostly bad news, but I'm going to finish up with what I think is some interesting ideas on how to change the status quo. So this talk is sort of a hybrid, a synthesis of a number of recent products that I've been involved with, including my book, Running Silver, a paper I published with Karin Lindberg in 2009 about the status of diadromous fishes in the North Atlantic. This was in Bioscience. Another paper that Jed Brown led the way on, looking at the actual empirical results of fish passage on large rivers, and turned out to be shockingly poor. And a paper that I have almost in press with a number of co-authors where we're looking at resilience as a paradigm to restore diadromous fish. So for those of you who don't think about diadromous fish day and night, I'm going to give you a 1-minute primer. Diadromy is a term for the freshwater sea fishes. It's an uncommon kind of life history pattern in the fish world. There are over 20,000 species of fish on the planet, and fewer than 1% are diadromous. It's also an evolutionary convergence. It occurs across a huge spectrum of fish, from those as primitive as sea lamprey to those as advanced as striped bass. And it has two divisions. Anadromy is the term for those fish that are spawned in rivers and migrate to sea. And those are fish such as salmon and shad and striped bass and sturgeon and sea lamprey. And then catadromy is the opposite. This is where fish are spawned at sea and migrate to freshwaters. This is more common in tropical areas, and the only catadromous species we have here are eels. This is the Atlantic assemblage. These are the fish that we see along the northeast coast that are considered diadromous. 15 species. The Hudson has most of these. We don't have salmon. We don't have spawning hickory shad. We lost smelt. We don't have brook trout. Probably the rivers that have the most of these would be the rivers in Maine. The Kennebec River has all of these except hickory shad. And I think the northeast U.S. has more diadromous fish species in one place than any other part of the world. And looking at, and here you see the evolutionary divergence, the incredible convergence of this kind of life history among different kinds of fishes. But in looking at this assemblage and thinking about restoration, these are really the key species to me. We have the river herrings, blueback herring and alewife, where I think we're doing a pretty good job. And I'll talk about that later. And then we have the American shad, which to me is the key species for bringing back these fish in rivers, because if you solve the shad problem, you solve the problem with anadromy. These are big fish. They need to go way up big rivers. And if you succeed for this species, everything else pretty much follows. So, first quiz question, why did the salmon cross the road? The answer is the swan. This is the migratory imperative. What has impressed me so much about these fish is their drive to get to where they need to go. And these are some salmon in Alaska crossing a road. I've been to Alaska, actually with my colleague Rob Moss, who's here, and we've seen these runs of fish coming out of the ocean. You just see rivers packed with these silver bodies. This is where this term running silver came from, the idea that some rivers were so packed with the thrashing bodies of silver-bodied fish that the waters were said to run silver. And I've seen salmon climbing 45-degree rocky slopes, like mountain climbers, to get up to where they think they want to spawn. It's really quite dramatic. And we have the same kind of drive occurring here. You know, this is the time of year now when big sturgeon are cruising up the Hudson right off our shores here. But we don't see them because we're on a murky estuary. But that same migratory imperative exists for those fish. And I had a really interesting example of the power of this migratory imperative when I was in Iran. I was in Iran about 10 years ago attending a sturgeon conference, and I went to a sturgeon hatchery on the shores of the southern Caspian, and I'm looking at this poster of the fishes of the Caspian, and I said, oh my goodness, there's a European eel here. And if you know the Caspian Sea is landlocked, and eels spawn in the Atlantic. It's also 100 feet below sea level, so I wondered, how is this at all possible? And they said, well, the eels show up. So I looked at the route that they take, and it was sort of mind-boggling. A European eel spawns somewhere around here in the Sargasso Sea, and they wrap around the Gulf Stream for about 300 days and develop from glass eels to elvers. And then anything that ends up in the Caspian has to pass through the Straits of Gibraltar, swim down the length of the Mediterranean, past Italy, go through the Straits of Bosporus in Istanbul, pass through the Black Sea, go through the Straits of Kerch into the Sea of Azov, swim into the Don River, and then there's a canal there that links the Don with the Volga. And that's how the eels must get in. And they go into the Volga or into the Caspian Sea. I did a quick estimate, that's about 4,000 miles. Not even to spawn, this is just to disperse from the spawning grounds. Remarkable. And these fish have distributions large and small. The Atlantic salmon has an enormous range in the North Atlantic. It was found from the Housatonic River, not far from here, in western Connecticut, all the way through Greenland and Iceland into Russia. So it has a tremendous distribution. And the opposite case is the Atlantic whitefish, a fish probably very few of you have ever heard of. This is a little species of whitefish that's anadromous that only occurred in two rivers in Nova Scotia, the Tusket and the little petite, they were pitchforked for fertilizer in the Tusket, and they're gone now. And there's about 2,000 fish left in the little petite, and they're kept from going to sea because they're afraid if they go to sea, they may never see them again. So it's an anadromous fish that's sort of kept in captive as a way of just keeping the species going. So the two extremes on range. And in looking at this life history of diadromine, I tried to come up with a sense of the benefits and costs to this kind of life history. Again, it's very rare, and yet when it succeeds beautifully. And the benefits seem to be the relative mortality differences between the habitats. These fish are leaving the ocean to go up rivers to leave their eggs in places where there's few predators. And the advantage seems to be that you're putting your eggs and your spawn in a location where there are not a lot of hungry mouths and sharp teeth like in the ocean. However, the ocean is where the food is. For those species that make their living in rivers, they have to have a smaller population size because there's a limiting carrying capacity in these rivers. Whereas in the ocean, from the point of view of these fish, oceans are essentially unlimited. If you look at striped bass populations on the East Coast, we have the migratory stocks like the Hudson, which is a huge population, and then we have striped bass in rivers in the Southeast, in South Carolina and Georgia, that are minute in comparison. These fish don't go to sea. They make their living in the river, and the populations are smaller. So the benefit seems to be the trade-offs between these two different habitats. But there are costs, too, to this kind of life history. One is the physiological adjustments of going from full-strength seawater to freshwater or backwards. That's going from 0 to 35 parts per thousand or back. That's a huge osmotic stress that only a few fish commit. There's also migration costs. To make that long trip takes a lot of energy. So there's a bioenergetic cost, and there's also predation risk. As that fish swims, it's exposing itself to predators. And then there's the cost of having ongoing suitability of two habitats. You're not depending on one habitat, you're depending on two, so you have sort of a double risk. And in fact, my colleague Martha Mather actually, I think, framed this very nicely in that paper we have potentially in press. She said historical advantages have become contemporary curses. This kind of switching back and forth between these two habitats was a huge advantage when those two habitats were still suitable. But rivers are no longer suitable, and this has now become a cost. And these species are also quite iconic and quite successful. This is an image from the Hudson. This is from Lossing's 1886 work, The Hudson from the Wilderness to the Sea. And it's an old lithograph. You see here the cotton nets are drying because in those days your nets had to be dried or they rotted. But it's no coincidence that the three species shown in this image for this fishery are anadromous. You have a sturgeon, striped bass, and a shad. You don't have a yellow perch and a white sucker and a brown bullhead. That's because these fish are going to the ocean, harvesting the trophic resources of the ocean, and bringing back that huge biomass right to the fisherman's nets. One question that often comes up with diadromine, or anadromine in particular, is the question of why home? And, salmon are famous for returning not only to the Natal River, but often to the same gravel bed that they were born in. And theory suggests that this has to do with the certainty of habitat suitability. This fish was produced from that river successfully. And to go into another river randomly is taking a gamble. But to go back to that same river, well, it's already certified. It produced that individual. So this is a way of, we think, of actually locking in the suitability of rivers in a way to individual populations. The only fish that doesn't home is a sea lamprey, and that's a very special case. But this has a corollary, and that's that there's a fine-tuning to its own migratory circuit. So there's huge variations among populations in the seasonal timing of the runs, the age of first spawning, whether they spawn once or several times in their lives, and there's also morphological adjustments. There are differences in body form and other factors that suggest they form not quite subspecies, but at a lower level, it used to be called races. And all of this fine-tuning has to do with the rivers. When these striped bass, for instance, leave the Delaware, the Chesapeake, and the Hudson and end up in Nantucket or Martha's Vineyard, those waters are the same for those stocks. They're not producing a selective force. It's the forces of the rivers that actually cause these changes that occur. And these changes were probably a lot larger than we know nowadays. Looking at the history of shad in the Hudson, commercial fishermen in the 1800s referred to different forms of shad such as yellowbacks, bluebacks, greenbacks, golden, pink, pink-faced, locust, chunker, and chunkhead. We don't know exactly what these differences were, but they were seeing something real. They're all gone now. We don't even have shad, never mind different forms of shad. Shad are really scarce. In the Potomac, they saw a May shad, a commercial fisherman, that was different from the April shad. The May shad had a chunkier tail area and a chunkier body. These were evolutionary adaptations to the particular life histories of those forms that were different from other forms in the same system. Atlantic salmon showed tremendous plasticity and variation. It was said that the Restigouche Indians in New Brunswick, you could hold a salmon up to them and they would tell you which river that salmon came from, because they were so intimately connected to their own fish and because there were such differences in the actual morphologies of the fish. And we still have some of this life history variation, which I think is really important, but it's much more hidden, and it's being revealed by new kinds of approaches like otolith analysis. In fact, some of the work that HRF has funded with Dave Secor and Karin Lindberg has revealed that there's a lot of life history variation that is not obvious to the eye, but is obvious to the otolith inspection. This is one of Dave Secor's plots for striped bass in the Hudson, and on the y-axis you have salinity, and on the x-axis you have age, and you can use the otolith to age the fish, but you can also look at the strontium-calcium ratios to get a sense of the salinity at any given age. And what you see is wide variation in life history. Here's a male that stayed in freshwater his entire life. Here's a individual that started out in seawater, decided it wanted to spend most of its time in freshwater. Here's a more typical pattern where you have a fish sort of every year spending more and more time in saltier water and going further from the river. And here you have one that went right to sea, but you can see its spawning migrations back to freshwater where the salinity drops quite a lot. And this life history variation is there, and it needs to be nurtured. So in working on the book, I was very interested in finding accounts of the Europeans' impressions of what they saw. We don't have data from those days, but we do have words that were written about what they saw in their diaries and their reports. And I have about 24 of these, and some of them are kind of fun, but also kind of heartbreaking in that they seem so extreme. And you have to remember that when Europeans came here, they were coming from a continent that had been overfished, overharvested, and polluted since the early Middle Ages. So they had no idea what pristine abundances looked like. But the accounts, these are three of my favorites. William Wood, 1634, alewives came up to the fresh rivers to spawn in such multitudes. It is almost incredible. Whitbourne, 1616, such abundance as is incredible. And my all-time favorite, William Byrd, Natural History of Virginia, 1728. In a word, it is unbelievable, indeed undescribable, as also incomprehensible what quantity is found there. One must behold oneself. I think he was impressed. And in thinking about what's happened to these fish, I happened to be in an antique shop one day, and I found this postcard in a whole set of postcards, and I yanked it out and I said, wow, this is telling the whole story of the vulnerabilities and also the sustainability of anadromous fish in one image. This is Cape Cod herring fishing, North Harwich, Massachusetts. Every other river in Cape Cod is named the Herring River because the herring runs are so important to Cape Cod. But this one in particular, I found some history on. And what you see here is a small stream with a system that's been sort of modified for the fishery. So you see a holding pool here with an area where the fishermen can pull a beach seine and haul their alewives right out onto the bank and stick them into barrels and send them right to the market. And there's also a little passageway here to the spawning pond. Now, if these fishermen wanted to catch alewives, these same fish, in February or October, they could send 500 ships out into the Atlantic Ocean, and they probably would not find any of them. But they know from past history that somewhere around March 20th, these fish will literally swim their way into their laps. So they're almost too cooperative in a way, and humans have too much influence and control over them. If these people are smart, they can allow enough fish to get upriver to spawn and have a reliable fishery year after year after year. And when I researched this history, turns out this little run produced 3,700 barrels of river herring a year with 400 fish to the barrel. But they did it over time because they allowed enough fish to spawn. But if you get greedy and you take too many, the fishery collapses. And this is kind of a metaphor for the larger picture of other fish in big rivers. So compare those accounts, those superlatives I gave you earlier with what we have today. river herring. This is the river herring crash just from 1950 to recent years in the dark area. And looking at the regulations now, remember, these fish are called the passenger pigeons of the sea. Massachusetts now, you can't keep a river herring. Rhode Island, total closure since 2006. Connecticut, near total closure since 2002. And in the Hudson, it's reduced and it's closed elsewhere. That's how far we've fallen. And in working on my book, I found that Thoreau was actually a great guide. He's one of my heroes. And he's more famous for a certain book he wrote about a pond, but I think his book about the Concord and Merrimack Rivers is a little gem. And he made the trip in 1839 with his brother. It was actually 2 weeks, but he called it a week. And he published it in 1849. It's not a well-read book, but in paddling down the Concord and Merrimack Rivers at a time when industrialization was just coming on strong in those systems, and people were excited about the possibilities of all these mills and all the money and products that would emanate from this, he was totally dismayed by what he saw coming for the ecology of the rivers. And he has quote after quote after quote where he said, basically, these fish are in big trouble. And he even asked this rather haunting question, who hears the fishes when they cry? And Thoreau was a great guide because he was so prescient in his observations and predictions about what happens to rivers. So what happened to his river? This is the river he floated on in 1839, not long after some of the largest mills in the world were built. And these are the Amiskiyig mills. Amiskiyig is a term for a falls nearby where fish could still get up the falls, but they would gather because there's a bit of an obstacle, and it means great fishing place. So today, there is a Amiskiyig Fishways visitors, learning and visitor center. And it's a really cool place. It has all the bells and whistles. It's got the viewing area to see fish coming by. You learn a lot, but you never see a fish. Turns out, anadromous fish almost never make it there. In 2014, they didn't have a single specimen of any species make it there, and that's not atypical. The only fish you see of this category is the statue when you come through the gate. This is the fish ladder, and it's basically not used. It's basically been a failure, even though it's a lovely attempt at what they call celebrating the magic of the Merrimack. Well, the magic isn't there. So what is the state of our anadromous fishes? We looked at a number of metrics on this, and there's not a whole lot of good data on size changes. But I have looked at sturgeon and shad, and if any of you have not seen this image, in reality, you must go up Route 9 to Hyde Park to the post office and see this up on the wall there. There's a mural of images about the history of the Hudson. And this is, of course, somewhat embellished, but not completely. This was a fishery mid-river, and sturgeon was said to reach 800 pounds in those days. Biggest I've ever seen is a little over 200, and even that size is not common anymore. Shad, there's some information on shad. If you're interested in sort of the big picture on shad, you should read John McPhee's The Founding Fish. And it turns out that in the Susquehanna in the early 1800s, there were fisheries where the average size was 8 pounds. And in those days, shad packed about 40 to the barrel. By the late 1800s, they were packing 100 to the same size barrel because they had diminished so much. And we don't see large shad anymore. Karin Lindberg and I looked at a number of metrics in our bioscience paper, including species and population persistence, and we looked at 22 species in the North Atlantic that were found either in Europe alone, North America alone, or both. And there were insufficient data on about half of them, mainly because they had lower value and there wasn't much study. But for the others, all had lost populations. The American shad had lost about half of its populations, and about a third of North American Atlantic salmon populations were extirpated. But what really grabbed us, of course, were the changes in abundance. Looking at Atlantic salmon, estimates are that all the rivers from the Housatonic to the St. Croix originally had run sizes that may have approached 500,000 annually, and there are those who think that's low, maybe it was more. In 2014, they were down to less than 400 total, and that's down from 600 something the year before. They're crashing. They may very well hit extirpation in American waters. But what really grabbed me was the history of the Susquehanna River shad. Susquehanna River was the shad river on the entire East Coast. It produced tens of millions of shad. And they used to run from the head of Chesapeake Bay to Lake Otsego in Cooperstown, New York. That's a 500-mile swim. And they would penetrate other rivers like the West Branch, and basically the whole Susquehanna River Valley ate shad all spring long. There were even vendors who would come into town and yell shadow and blow horns, and housewives would come out and buy their shad, and they would have these shad bakes. And here you see an image of a shad catch being landed. And there were a couple of accounts that really amazed me. There was one where they talked about in the early 1800s in a fishery called the Webb Fishery west of Scranton. They would post somebody on a hill with a spyglass, and he would look for a bulge in the water. As the shad entered that section of river, the water would start to boil and bulge from the huge school of shad pushing the water around. And then there was a fishery at the mouth of the river called the Stump Farm Fishery, which had a hull seine, a very long hull seine. And they set it out one day, and a fierce northwest wind blew up, and they couldn't pull it in for 4 days. So it basically blocked the run for 4 days. Filled up with fish. It took 3.5 days to actually land the entire net. It took several days to empty out the net. It was estimated there were about 15 million river herring and shad taken in that one haul. So what happened to the Susquehanna River shad? Well, they built 4 dams in the lower river in the early 1900s. They did not put any fish passage on them. Turns out it wouldn't have mattered because the fish passage isn't working anyway that they eventually did put in. And they blocked these fish that used to run 500 miles to Lake Otsego to now only having free access to the first 10 miles of river. So that fishery just collapsed completely. And over time, they put in fish elevators and fish ladders on the first 4 dams in order to get fish up to at least the lowermost spawning grounds in the system. And the goal these days, this is the stated goal, to get 750,000 past the 4th dam. That's not an ambitious goal. This is way less than came into the river originally. It's really quite small as a goal. These were the actual counts for 2014. There were 10,000 past the first dam, 2,500 past the second, 1,300 past the third, and 8 fish past the fourth. Try to get a bulge in the water from 8 fish. And this is more than 2011 when none made it. So this has been an utter failure. And Karin and I looked at time series for 31 populations and species where we had good data. And what you have on the left side are the American shores, and on the right side, the European shores. And in every case, the data have been normalized to 1. So they've all been standardized to 1. And what grabs you, of course, is the pattern. It's basically this, over and over again, crashes down to almost 0. A couple of interesting things about it. One is that striped bass crashed to near 0 for the Chesapeake and rebounded. That's our one success story on the East Coast. And that's largely because we had one strong driver who was overfishing. We did the right thing. We shut down the fishery, and the fish came back. The other thing is that in almost every case, we don't have true extirpations. These fish flirt with extinction, but they don't quite hit 0. And either that's just sort of a coincidence among all these stocks, or something else is going on here. So I'll get back to that later. But they just basically hang around 0, a little above in these relic stock sizes. I call it riding the asymptote. They're basically just dangling there right above extinction, but not quite hitting it. So what happened to these fish? Well, if you thought about anadromous fish 20 or 30 years ago and asked what the reason is for their decline, you'd probably get these 3 answers in this order: dams, and more dams, overfishing, and pollution. And there's no doubt that these are sort of the big 3 and have been the big 3, but it's more complicated than that. Looking at dams, Karin, in one of her papers, looked at the distance that shad can swim into East Coast rivers and how much has been lost over time using this old map from the 1800s of shad penetration. And she found they lost about 40% of their habitat. So that's a huge effect right there. And that's assuming they can get past the dams. This is 40%, but it's not really, it's a much more acute effect than that because very few fish are making it past the dams. Looking at the Hudson watershed, dams are ubiquitous in the American landscape. There are about 100,000 dams of 6 feet and larger. In the Hudson alone, this is the pattern of dam building in the Hudson. Remember, in those days, colonial times, the only power you had, other than your own arms and shoulders, was animal power and water power. And so there was this tendency to dam like crazy. And right now we have about 800 dams still existing in the Hudson watershed. Many of them no longer serve any purpose. None of them have to my knowledge, come down yet for environmental reasons. There's now some interest in this happening, thank goodness. But there's huge possibilities to restore the Hudson watershed and just create connectivity not only for the anadromous fish, but for the resident species that need to have connectivity within these systems. Every time you put a dam up, you're creating a little island, a river, and islands have issues with long-term sustainability. Overfishing is not that knotty a problem, really. What tends to happen is that we overfish so far that there comes a point when people are more ready to give up their fishery because they become commercially inviable. So it's not a complicated problem. It's just a matter of having the societal will to enforce better fishery policy. But it's not complicated like some of these other issues are. And pollution, to me, is a weak third. There's no doubt that pollution can cause problems for these fish. And in fact, in the Delaware River, there was such low oxygen levels for much of the 1900s that it was called a chemical dam because the fish could not move past in springtime. So it acted as a dam in effect. And we still have hog waste coming out in some North Carolina rivers, and we still have pollution. But for the most part, industrial contamination is not going to destroy these runs. Low oxygen is a problem, but we've done a much better job of that since the Clean Water Act. Newer threats include non-native species, which I think is an underrated effect. Black bass are not native to the Hudson or New England, and largemouth bass is basically a vacuum cleaner with fins. It's a voracious predator of out-migrating juvenile shad and river herring. We have snakeheads coming on strong in the Chesapeake. We have flathead channel catfish in the Delaware and Chesapeake now. These are voracious predators. And then we have species like the carp and the zebra mussel changing the ecology of systems. But if we think that these fish go upstream to leave their eggs in safe places, by introducing all these predators, we're introducing a gauntlet that they have to pass in order to get to their nursery grounds. And I think this has had a underappreciated effect on these fish. Climate change is starting to show up as a major factor. I shot this photograph when I worked on the Westway study. It might be the last photograph of the Hudson River smelt. Smelt ran to the Delaware River in 1900. They retreated to as far south as the Hudson after that. They ran into the Hudson tributaries into the 70s and the main stem until 1998, when the last 4 individuals were seen. They've since retreated from Connecticut, and they're getting scarce in Massachusetts. So it seems to be a clear case of a retreat of a cold water species being chased northward by warming temperatures. We've also seen changes in phenologies of fish. Atlantic salmon and alewives have been found to be coming into Maine rivers 2 weeks earlier than they did in previous decades. So we're changing the timing of these runs, and we're not sure how that's affecting their viability. Then there are these somewhat forgotten threats. If you have any interest or you're old enough to remember the battles on the Hudson River concerning power plants, well, those power plants are still out there. It's not so high on our radar screens anymore. And in fact, over time, I think we're going to go from open cycle cooling to closed cycle cooling, so it'll become less of a threat. But there are those who believe that the literally billions of larvae and eggs that are taken into power plants and killed every year in the Hudson are depressing shad and striped bass stocks and other species too. And we shouldn't forget that so-called industrial fishing is still out there. And another interesting aspect to all this is we're not even sure what a natural river should look like anymore. This is our kind of paragon of a natural river, basically a single channel meandering type river with a wide and deep channel and a flat floodplain. But there's new evidence now that our rivers didn't look like this originally. And they look much more like this. This is a braided river from Kansas. But rivers on the East Coast probably were much more like this too, except perhaps in the Rocky New England area, where you had a lot of side channels, you had a lot of shallow little embayments, a lot of woody debris, and a lot more sort of habitat for young fish. What changed it all, here's an example. This is an extreme example. This is the Mississippi. And there's a whole series of charts on the history of riverbed changes in the Mississippi. And it's almost like artwork. And the Mississippi, of course, has very low gradient. So the river was free to wander, but it's incredible how much activity that river showed through time in changing its riverbed. Of course, now it's locked in by the Army Corps. This is what the river wanted to be before it was altered. And why this happened had to do with the fact that we had so many of these mill dams in the Northeast that they would then catch sediment behind them. And here you see the sediment behind the dam, and then this is prior to the dam here. And it's much finer. The fine sediments are being caught by the dam instead of going out to sea. And looking at it as a cross-section, what this great paper, Walter and Merritt's in Science in 2008, I urge you to read it if you have any interest in rivers, showed was that time and time again across the Northeast, these sediment beds that now form the banks of these rivers are artifacts of these dams. And in fact, originally these rivers were shallow and wide and braided. So we're asking these fish now to adapt to rivers that they did not evolve in concert with. And maybe the biggest threat of all is the loss of memory, what's called the shifting baseline syndrome. I'm sure most of you are aware of this, but this was an idea promoted by the fish biologist Daniel Pauly, and he said that each generation of fisheries scientists accepts as a baseline the stock size and species composition that occurred at the beginning of their careers and uses this to evaluate changes. When the next generation starts its career, the stocks have further declined, but it is the stocks at that time that serve as a new baseline. This is a real phenomenon in the entire conservation world, which is why the whole new field of historical ecology is turning out to be so important to provide reference points for what was there originally. And to give you a couple of examples of shifting baselines in action, one is quantitative, one is qualitative. This is the quantitative one. These are shad landings on the East Coast for 1887 to about a little past 2000. And you can, this is, I think, in millions of kilograms. I forget which unit it is. But the point is, you can see nothing to be proud of. We crashed tremendously looking at the recent versus 1887. I mean, wow, what a decline. Let's go back further in time. Here's 1887 compared to 1814. This is the importance of going back in time to get a perspective on the possibilities. We'll never restore it to anywhere near that, but we should at least know that we started out at that point and declined that far. Another really interesting, weird example is this. Anybody come across this in their internet viewing last year, or 2013 actually? This is a sea lamprey that was shot by a bow fisherman in New Jersey in the Raritan River in spring of 2012. And the fisherman shot this great photograph, and that winter his buddies decided to post photographs of their weirdest fish catches. So he posted this on Reddit. Within a day or two, there were 1 million plus hits on it, and it got picked up by the media about how there was a sea monster that was shot in the New Jersey River. And sure. And before you knew it, there were news articles all about the sea monster in, I did a quick search yesterday, the Philippines, France, the UK, and here was the species that belongs in the Raritan River that used to run up there for thousands of years, and it was now being treated as if it was from outer space. It was the reaction to this Diadromous fish being in this normal river was completely insane. Another really great case of a shifting baseline. So what can be done? This is quiz question number 2. What did the fish say when it swam into the wall? Oh, damn. This is the Conowingo Dam that I spoke about on the Susquehanna River. And this is the one that's 10 miles from the mouth of the river. It's a huge dam. And this is what has basically destroyed this incredible run. So, in looking for...
Sorry.
Okay.
The webinar closed.
Should I wait a minute?
Yes.
Tell them the joke.
That was my second joke. There'll be Discordville, and you can still catch my buddy just caught 5 the other day there. But it's hard to get shad in a fish market these days. Okay, so looking forward on what we can do about all this, You know, dams, of course, I gave you a hint there, is really the place where I would put my effort. I broke the various drivers into different categories. So we have one that I think is largely rectified, and that's pollution. I'm not saying that our rivers are crystal clear and clean, but you know, the pollution wars are largely won in this country, in my opinion, except for a few nagging situations. There are some issues that are essentially untractable. The 9 native species are here to stay. Once they get into a system, they're not going anywhere. The thing to do is prevent them, and we're saddled with a legacy now of these non-native species, and also slow drip of more of them into our systems because we're not vigilant about that. And climate, is a huge issue, but I'm not kidding anybody. We're not changing that too quickly. Then we have what I call the categories that are tractable and already applied, and that's overfishing. But then we have one that's tractable but unrectified, and that's dams. That's what I want to focus on. So, the ideal situation for most rivers is dam removal. And in my book, I came up with this phrase that every dam should have an existential crisis. And I mean that in the sense that every dam should be looked at in some kind of I would say, comprehensive program across the country with some estimate or assessment of whether that dam should persist through time or not. And many dams serve really useful work purposes. We drink our water in New York City from the Catskill reservoirs. Those aren't coming down anytime soon. I know that. But of those 800 dams I showed you in the Hudson Valley, very few of them serve any purpose anymore. And there are many dams along the East Coast and elsewhere that just exist through inertia. They're big, they're concrete and earthen masses, and you can't just go puff and blow them down. So it would be great to actually have, rather than sort of the organic grassroots regionalized effort, to have some kind of a national program on this. And it's incredibly effective. McPhee wrote about the breaching of the Edwards Dam on the Kennebec on July 1st, 1999. And this opened up 17 miles of river that used to be used by sturgeon and shad and salmon and other species. It allowed access for the first time in 160 years to a tributary upstream called the Sebasticook. The Sebasticook happens to be an alewife Shangri-La. They love it. And within a few years, that run went from 0, because they couldn't reach it, to almost 3 million. And it's now the biggest alewife run on the East Coast. And in fact, it's so important ecologically. They saw so many eagles around it that one day they took a helicopter and just swooped the area to drive them out of the trees. And there were 52 eagles that were making a living eating the alewives, migrating up the stream. So dam removal works, but it's not always possible. When it's not possible, another option is to use a ladder. And fish ladders are devices that are designed to allow fish to work their way up this artificial, engineered kind of pathway into the reservoir above and hopefully to the spawning grounds. And sometimes they work well, and sometimes they don't. It's been described making these as halfway between an art and a science. And they're very species selective. Sturgeon and striped bass abhor them, and river herring will utilize them pretty freely. Shad depends on the situation. And some very good people that I know that I respect are working on making fish ladders better. And I think there's room for improvement, but I don't think they're the panacea that we thought the results suggest not. Another option is to take an elevator. And there are some big dams that have fish elevators on them. And basically, the fish enter an attraction flow area and go into what's called a hopper, and they press the floor they want, and they go up to the reservoir, and then there's some biologist, usually with his first job in the field after school, at some window, counting them as they go past, as they go into the reservoir. And these things can work on more species than the fish ladders, but they often don't work. When I was working on the book, I went to the Conowingo in 2012, I think it was, and we were having a rare spring drought, and the fish were aggregated like crazy below the dam, but that's because the elevator wasn't working, because it was too dry. And then I went to the Holyoke Dam in Connecticut in 2013, and the elevator wasn't working because there was too much water. So these are causing big problems in the timing of these fish's migrations, even if they do pass fish here and there. Finally, they can take a truck, and this is kind of an ironic name for a fish migration, Operation Fish Run on a truck. This is kind of a triage approach where you use the internal combustion engine to get fish that should be beating their fins to get upstream, to get up to where they belong to spawn. And this is done sometimes just to keep a run alive. Interestingly, it sometimes works better than the fish passage that's engineered because the fish kind of get it over with in one shot instead of having to face this gauntlet of dams and figuring out each dam and getting past them. So the Susquehanna shad run was better in the days when they were using the truck than when now they're relying on the fish passage alone. So looking forward now, I see two divergent pathways for the future of diadromous fish on the East Coast. I think smaller rivers were doing pretty well. It turns out that river herring like fish ladders, or at least adapt to them reasonably well, and there's a lot of grassroots effort now in getting, and also agency effort in getting river herring back into rivers where they belong. So I see a lot of good news here, even though we're not anywhere near where we need to be in total restoration. But for larger rivers, it's a gloomy story, especially for shad and salmon. So going with the small rivers first, here you see a couple of river herring climbing over a little drop in a brook, and they do this very well, which is why they're sort of pre-adapted to fish ladders. Fish ladder is not that different from a brook with a series of little steps. So they will utilize fish ladders. And Sarah Tobing is here. She's been very involved with getting the fish ladder built on the Bronx River. This is, I think, the first fish ladder installed in the Hudson River watershed. New York City Parks deserves credit for this. They've been working on this for many years now, and we think over time, otherwise we'll use this and probably sustain a large run into.
Where on the
This is by the Bronx Zoo, 182nd Street area, and right in the heart of the most urban part of one of the most urban parts of New York City. So, if it happens here, you know the old saying, it can happen anywhere. And there's a lot going on in smaller rivers in general with cooperation between grassroots groups and agencies. This is the Blackstone River. This is in Rhode Island. This is the Slater Mill, the first major cotton mill in this country. The Blackstone was considered America's hardest working river because it had mill after mill after mill. And now it's being restored by guys like this guy, John Marsland, who's an old timer who just decided he was sick of the status quo and with his buddies started to restore fish passage and the health of the river. Here's a little fish ladder he built that he takes to classes to show how it works. And these guys are pulling tires out of the river and cars and selling the cars for money to stock fish in schoolrooms so that kids get used to working with fish and pressuring the agencies to do the right thing. And it's really been very impressive in some of these NGO efforts. And one new area that's applied more to smaller streams and larger streams that I'm very excited about are nature-like fishways. This is on the Naugatuck River. This is Route 8 above it in Seymour, Connecticut. And Steve Gephardt is one of my heroes. He works for Connecticut, the agency that takes care of fish passage in Connecticut. And they don't leave any opportunity unmet. They wanted to bring fish up the Naugatuck again, including shad, and they realized they couldn't take this dam down because of its close location to those bridge pilings, so they got funding for a nature-like fishway. So they basically wrapped the river around the dam. So this passageway here, which looks like a real river, is actually totally man-made, and fish don't know the difference, and they're going to be flying up that fish ladder and wrapping around to the pond above, and with a lot less, fewer issues than a fish ladder would normally have. And I went to the opening ceremony last fall, and actually Hillary was supposed to be there, but she had some important commitment she couldn't show. But there were a lot of Senator Blumenthal was there and some other heavyweights. But I enjoyed the talk that was given by John Bullard, who's a high-level administrator for NOAA. He said he loves this kind of project because this is the kind of project that makes fish. His job is to make fish. And he saw this as a project that was going to make fish and restore higher numbers of fish to the system. And he just boiled it down to the essence here, which I liked. So if it's working well for small rivers, why isn't it working well for the most part, for large rivers? And there's many reasons. I can go into this, in great detail, but I'm going to boil it down to what I think are two countervailing forces of resilience. What I mean by that is that, in the positive sense, we have these anti-Ali effects. Ali effects is a term in biology for effects where when populations get small, they tend to crash. You have depensation, where individuals can't find each other to mate, for instance, and so you get this downward crash. And I showed you before how so many of these stocks are running next to the asymptote, but not quite hitting zero. I think that's because they have a response to this effect where they tend to aggregate in space and time. So instead of having a long run across many months over a large area, you get a small run over a short period of time. And that keeps them going. So that's the positive response to the Lee effect. On the negative side, we have the loss of the storage effect. The storage effect is another sort of fancy term for the idea that when fish live in variable environments, they have to have enough built-up biomass and age classes so that they can ride out the lean years and then produce a lot of eggs during the good years. So we lost the storage effect on many rivers because many of these rivers don't allow return migrations of the shad once they spawn. So you basically allow these fish to spawn once. You're not building up multiple age classes. You're not allowing big fish to come back because these are little guys who are coming to spawn the first time. So you're living on a knife edge where you have, if you have good conditions for a few years, maybe you can sustain a population. You get a few bad years, there's no reservoir to buffer, and they crash. So there's a sort of a war going on between these two forces, and that's why these, in my opinion, these fish are existing as these relic stocks. So we looked at the actual empirical results of hydrofish passage in a paper led by my colleague Jed Brown. It was published in 2013. And we looked at the Merrimack River, where Thoreau paddled, the Connecticut River, and the Susquehanna River. And the Merrimack has two big dams in its lower reaches, the Essex and Pawtucket. The Connecticut has three dams that are spread out further. The Vernon Dam is all the way up in Vermont. And the Susquehanna River has those four dams in the first 40, 50 miles near its mouth. And these are the actual successes of American shad passed over the final dam in the gauntlet. So this is in thousands of American shad, and you can see that it's not a large number in any of these cases. And then we have the number of fish passed as a percent of target. So remember I said that the Susquehanna has a target of 750,000, which is way below what was there originally. Same is true for these other rivers. They have targets that are way below what their primordial run sizes probably were, but they're still, a lot higher than what we actually see these days. So looking at a percentage of the targets, you see that the Merrimack had one time when it got up to about a quarter of its target, but it crashed right away, and the Susquehanna and Connecticut have been really quite abysmal. So in these two cases, you could say, well, maybe it's not the dams, though. Maybe it's the overfishing at sea. Maybe it's environmental factors at sea. Maybe it's something else. The one that really kind of nails it is this next figure. These are passage efficiencies. This is looking at the number of fish that make it past the first dam, that make it to the second dam in blue, and the last dam in the gauntlet in red. And one of the corollaries to having fish passage on these big dams is you can count the fish. You know exactly how many fish came past each dam. So in the case of the Merrimack, it was up to about 40%, 35% to the second dam in its peak years. But to the last dam and to that visitor center I mentioned, it's basically flat line around zero. For the Connecticut, it's been quite low over the course of time. And the Susquehanna, it was occasionally would get decent to the second dam, but past the fourth dam in the gauntlet, it was near zero. This is a controlled experiment. There's nothing else going on here. There's no overfishing. There's no other factors here. These are the number of fish that pass the first dam that get past the last dam. So you can't blame this on anything else. This is the efficiencies of these dams, and they're quite poor. One idea that I've been thinking about lately is the question of scale when it comes to fish passage on these dams. This is the Rainbow Dam on the Farmington River, which is a tributary to the Connecticut. And this is a ladder that's very steep. It's 68 feet to the top of this over a fairly sharp incline. And it's meant for things like shad and salmon. And a shad is a big ocean, big river fish. It's being asked to basically squeeze into these little chambers and work its way upstream. Shad don't like this. They don't pass very often. And in fact, it's been recognized as being so bad that they're now installing a fish elevator in its place. This is not that atypical for East Coast fish ladders. Compare that to the West Coast. The only fish ladder that I'm aware of that works well for shad anywhere in this country is on the Bonneville Dam in the Columbia River. And shad are not native to the West Coast. And it may be one of the reasons why the population is so big is because it's not native. It doesn't have the same array of predators and parasites. But meanwhile, the Columbia River has a staggeringly huge run of shad. And they come up a fish ladder. And unlike of this size. Compare that to the image I showed you before of the fish ladder on the Farmington.
Which one?
This is like a river compared to that little narrow chute. And when you look at the data, the Columbia River flow is an extraordinary, almost 300,000 cubic feet per second. I mean, that's a massive amount of water. The Bonneville ladder uses about 2,000 or 3,000 cubic feet per second. Compare that ladder size to the size of the entire river on the East Coast. The Pawcatuck River, which is a shad river, 675, way less than the Bonneville Dam ladder. The Kennebec, which is a pretty big river by our standards, only 2 or 3 times the size of the Bonneville Dam ladder, and so on. And the average ladder flow on the East Coast is about 30 to 50 cubic feet per second, which is 2 orders of magnitude lower than the Bonneville ladder. So the question is there really enough water for fish and hydropower on the East Coast? I would say maybe not. And what can be done? I want to sort of synthesize what I've been saying now about comparing this generic healthy river with engineering diagrams of 2 rivers in Maine. And I'm not picking on Maine. Maine actually is doing some very nice work on fish passage, as are Connecticut and Rhode Island and Massachusetts. But in a healthy river, you would have several age classes of fish, let's say shad, coming to the river in the spring between, let's say, late March and June. And they would then come up this river, and maybe different races or different life history variants would use different tributaries. Maybe the early fish would be in the lower tributaries, the later fish would be in the upper tributaries. They might develop some of these morphological differences over time. They would produce young at the right point in time. You would have large numbers of young produced that would then use the estuary, go to sea, and return again. And you would have a very large, healthy run. Compare that to, let's say, 2 rivers that I just chose sort of randomly, the Androscoggin and the Kennebec. A fish coming to a river like this, first of all, you can have a small population returning. So they're going to contract in space and time. So instead of hedging their bets by coming across the entire season and spawning over a long period of time, where hopefully some portion of those fish will hit the right conditions and produce a lot of young, they're basically gambling and coming together all at once in one area. They got to pass the first dam. None of them have been there before because there's poor return passage for adults, so they're naive to the system. They got to figure out the first elevator or ladder. Okay, maybe over the course of a few days or a week, some of them get through. All of a sudden, they're in a big reservoir. The reservoir has no current. They don't know which direction to go. They got to figure out where the flow is coming in. That may cost them some more time. They come to the second dam. It's another fish passage device. They got to figure that out. They lose a few more days doing that. They get over that. It's another reservoir. In the case of 3 or 4 of these, they may end up in the spawning grounds weeks later than they normally would have in order to capitalize on the production cycle of that river. Then the adults may spawn. Some of those young will survive. The adults may or may not get back to the ocean. In many cases, they can't get back. The young will then out-migrate. They face the same barriers. They have to go through turbines or spillover dams or use, in some cases, there are return devices, which sometimes work well and sometimes don't. They go to sea, and then they come back again as a very small population and repeat the pattern. So you get a tendency to crash here, and you get long-time sustainability here. And in general, it raises the question, does habitat diversity equal life history diversity equal resilience and abundance? We have great diversity here. We would have in a healthy system beaver dams and little ponds at the headwaters and all kinds of options for the fish to use, whereas here they have almost no variability in space and time. And one of the challenges, I think, in rebuilding these populations is recreating or recomplexifying rivers with greater habitat diversity to provide greater life history diversity, which will then buffer their long-term survival. So I want to conclude with some ideas about what we can do about this. And I think that now is actually a potentially transformative time for large hydro dams. I think it's time to make fish again. And I say that because, number one, the brown paper, for instance, basically cements the recognition that traditional engineered fishways haven't succeeded in restoring these stocks. We gave these things more than half a century to work, and populations have plummeted. They're not going to work. Very good fish passage people will tweak them, they'll make some improvements, we could do better. But they're not going to bring orders of magnitude changes. The Susquehanna shad are down 5 orders of magnitude. It's not going to happen by tweaking fish ladders. Also, the energy mix is rapidly changing. We're now having industrial scale solar and wind power come on strong. So there are new options. We also have smart homes that are providing a great deal of conservation and reducing energy needs. We also have the fact that dams don't last forever. You know, we look at a dam, we think of it as a monolithic kind of Egyptian sphinx, but they become dangerous over time. They crack, they fall into disrepair. We are going to have to start dealing with old dams sooner than later, so we might as well start thinking about that. And some of them are sedimenting very badly. The Conowingo Dam is filled with sediment now, and the other Susquehanna dams too. And it's gotten so bad, all these factors, that the Republican governor of Maryland, the Republican governor, actually said it's time to start thinking about maybe taking down the Conowingo Dam, which I was amazed at. And finally, many dams are coming up for FERC relicensing, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And the thing about FERC relicensing is that it locks in business as usual for 30, 40, or 50 years. So there's always a period where the new regime is negotiated, so they tweak the fish passage, or they do this or that. But then it locks in because these hydro companies want certainty for their investors for the next period of time. So we're about to lock in business as usual on many of these dams, and that's not a good thing. So one idea that Carmen Lindbergh and I, and Amy Rowe was involved too, was kind of suggested as a little hint in an op-ed we wrote in the New York Times last fall called Let the River Run Wild, which was making a case for taking down the Conowingo Dam. And this is sort of the status quo condition. We have a dam, we have a river, we have a reservoir behind it, and we have fish that come up to the dam, and they get blocked, and maybe you have a relic run, maybe you don't, maybe a few fish get over it, but maybe not. So this is what we're starting with. This is the condition today. The idea we're talking about now is, and we want to explore further, is what I call the shared river concept, or also re-rivering. And that's the idea of actually breaching or taking down a dam. And that gives you two things right away that are essential. It gives you real estate that wasn't available before, because you have the reservoir bottom now available. And it gives you still the existing transmission lines that were there for the hydropower. And if you open up the river, right away you're going to have the fish penetrating it like in the Kennebec, and you're going to restore the run. But meanwhile, you have to replace the energy because energy is serious business. So one of the things you could do is build a run-of-the-river hydro facility where instead of taking all the water of the river for the hydro dam, you route some of it through a side channel and you take some power from the river. So you're not giving up all your hydropower, but you're taking a lot less in order to open up the system. And these things are around, and it's a very viable concept. This is nothing pie in the sky. You also have all this real estate where theoretically you could put huge solar industrial arrays. And we just did back in the envelope calculations for the Conowingo, and you could replace the power lost from the hydro dam just with the solar alone on the land. Also, if you had any backwaters, Japan is now using floating solar on its ponds, and that's working out very well too. So theoretically, you could add a lot of solar to that energy mix. But remember that most reservoirs occur in valleys that have ridges around them or mountains, so you could also add wind power. And you could very quickly create sort of an energy park that would either duplicate or exceed the power lost from the hydro company. Finally, if you did not have enough power, you could always fall back on a fossil fuel plant where you have closed cycle cooling, where you're using the same water over and over again and not really hurting the river. This is one scenario that I think makes a lot of sense for the future. We're not at a point anymore with all these options where we have to essentially hand our rivers over to these hydro companies and say you have sovereignty over the life of the river. And there are other possible models too. For instance, if you don't like the idea of having the industrial park at that site, maybe you could sell the land for conservation easements or for some kind of well-done development and then use that funding to provide equivalent power somewhere else. I think landfills are begging for solar power. It seems like a natural. So the point is, I think that we have options now, and this is the time to start talking about just changing the paradigm of how we get energy from rivers and how we have these energy provisions coexist with the fish runs that should be there. So just want to finish up with some of Thoreau's final thoughts. Again, it's a fascinating book. And again, he comes back to the fish. He said, "Poor shad, where is thy redress? Still wandering the sea in thy scaly armor to inquire humbly at the mouths of rivers He thought the fish were basically in trouble. So he urged them to keep a stiff fin then and stem all the tides down Mason Mead. Thank you.
Questions?
Questions or comments? Yes.
What's happening on the Peconic River? Have they been successful with letting the alewives
In the Peconic?
in the Peconic? Yeah.
Yeah, it's working out great. Byron Young, who's a retired DEC biologist, has taken the lead on that, along with some colleagues. And they put a nature-like fishway right in downtown Riverhead at Grangevale Park. It works beautifully. The fish go flying up the river. Unfortunately, they hit their heads against several of the dams, but the first one is now successfully passed. And I think over time, that river, which is the Mississippi of Long Island rivers, is going to become a huge alewife producer.
Okay. Is there a way for the fish to...
Yeah, they can go right down that nature-like fishway. So, but there are several other dams that have to be dealt with, and there's an active group, grassroots group, that's working hard on making that happen. I'm very hopeful for that river.
Let's see whether we have any questions from off speed. Okay, thanks. Not yet.
John, I'm curious, you mentioned overfishing out at sea, and that's another tractable problem. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how that relates in terms of impacts relative to the dam.
It depends on the species. The striped bass, for instance, don't go far enough up rivers that dams are a big issue for them because they're kind of like mid-river spawners. So fishing is the big variable when it comes to striped bass. For salmon, dams are a huge issue, but there's been a lot of high seas fishing in the North Atlantic that also is simultaneously hurting the salmon populations. Shad are no longer fished in the ocean, so whatever is happening with shad now is happening at the level of rivers. River herring are not fished for on purpose in the ocean, but they tend to mix with Atlantic herring, and they're often scooped up, and they might be 1%, 2% river herring in a big Atlantic herring catch. And that chips away at their numbers. So it really depends on the species. But for the most part, as I said, once the species becomes kind of rare and commercially inviable, then it tends to be a solution to the fishing problem. Sturgeon are now, Atlantic sturgeon are now considered off limits, but there was no real clientele for them anymore. They were only fished by 4 people in the Hudson, so there was no pushback against that. So that's kind of what happens with overfishing. So overfishing is not the issue at the moment by any means, but it's still something to keep track of.
We have one on the bottom there, John, bycatch.
Well, I guess I just talked about that, and that's from Dan Hasselman, who's worked on these issues.
Could you repeat the question, John?
Yeah, Dan Hasselman is asking to what extent do you believe bycatch and ocean fisheries may be impacting recovery. And it's, as I said, it's being worked on mainly for river herring, and it's being shown to be depressing their stocks somewhat. And it needs to be dealt with. There's actually a nice study going on now to look at where river herring occur in the ocean to steer fishermen away from those hotspot areas so they avoid them when they go after the river herring. So it's an issue, but I think there's movement towards resolution on that. Was a question here?
Yeah, it seems like there's a lot of inertia around keeping dams up. What would...
The inertia is that it's a big effort, and you have to have people who are willing to fight the administrative battles to make this happen and find the funding. So the states that have been very successful at this have people who work on this full time, like Connecticut and Massachusetts. This is all they do, and they do a beautiful job of it. But often the lake behind the dam has residents who like having the ponded water and have a canoe in their back lawn. They want to go out. They don't want to give up their dam. There's issues sometimes with contaminants behind dams that may be released. There are people who like the dam for historical value. So there's always a set of people who are going to be fighting a dam removal, and then you have to find the funding, and you have to sell it to your local population. This takes a great deal of effort.
So is it legislative? Is it agencies? Is it...
The best results seem to occur where you have grassroots people working with agency people. Steve Gephardt says that he could never, in his agency, do it without the grassroots efforts, and they could never do it without him. But by combining those forces well, I think we need a little more of that in New York State, although I think I see room for, I see some growth occurring in this idea of taking down dams in New York State. There's room for optimism. You have to develop that nexus. And what we could use are people in New York State who kind of bridge the agency NGO gap perhaps a little more effectively. And I think there's great possibilities here for New York State. We just have to move forward on it.
What about the New York City water supply from the Catskills and the Croton? There are some dams there.
Those dams are here to stay. We're not giving up the drinking water.
You need the water.
Yeah, I'm not arguing that they should be taken down. Yes.
Yes, what role does the melting of ice in the northern Atlantic Ocean have on fish finding new migration to new areas?
Well, not any that I'm aware of. The Gulf of Maine has become warmer and warmer and warmer. It's not getting colder. So, in fact, the Gulf of Maine has warmed up phenomenally fast. And we're getting movements of fish to the north now. We're getting southern species showing up to the north. So, if anything, it's the opposite. The ice is not a factor. It's the lack of ice that's a factor. And, in fact, striped bass are exploding in their Canadian range now as waters get warmer, to the point where now they're worried about the striped bass predator effects on the salmon in the Miramichi River, because that population has become huge, and striped bass are major predators. So the ecologies are changing because of climate change, and we're seeing it with these fish too, and everything else. Back there.
This one, it seems like the herrings are base of the food chain. When you got a 5 order of magnitude disruption, I mean, I love the colleague of yours, he's got to make fish. I mean, it seems like the way fish are always been made, were through the herring, which was the base of the food chain, literally drove the evolution of the cetaceans and the rest. I mean, is this an option? Because it just seems like there's a huge negative in overall secondary productivity because the herrings are literally not there.
Yeah, so are you saying should that be a sales, like a leverage point for restoration?
I guess one would hope for something like a regulatory framework or something.
Yeah, the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission is very concerned about river herring now, and they have a lot of programs now. They're asking states to develop programs within the states to restore runs. So that's happening in a big way. The Pew Foundation has had a big bait fish program where they're just basically calling attention to prey fish around the world of all different species as being the base of the food chain. So there's a growing recognition that they are critical. They are the base of the food chain when you think about larger fish. So sure.
Is there anything how quickly this happened? I took the Army Corps up the Bronx River. It was May 1st, 1999, so it's not even 30 years. And now we're already putting a fish on in.
Dennis.
John, you mentioned efforts that you and others are thinking about improving fish getting over the dams. But what's going on with getting the fish back over? It seems to me that dams like Conowingo, if you get them over the dam, it's not a good chance of them getting back over the dam safely.
Yeah.
What's on the...
Well, fish passage professionals are working on that, and some dams have facilities to try to allow adults and young of the year to get over, and others just rely on fish. The young of the year can sometimes drop over the top of the dam and just slide down. Sometimes they crash on the rocks, depending. And they also can go through hydro turbines, but some of them will be cut by the turbines. So it's a very mixed bag, and that needs more exploration. The Brown paper looked at success getting upriver. I'd like to actually do a synthesis of empirical data on downriver movements too. But overall, it's not terrific, but it varies tremendously from dam to dam and river to river.
What do they do in the Bonneville? Do you have any idea how they fish come back?
I don't actually.
You got Carnes asking you, whoops.
Carnes asking what's the best options for sturgeons. Sturgeons, the big driver with sturgeons is not dams because they spawn in the main stem for the most part of big rivers. So the option there is to keep fishing pressure off them, and we're doing that successfully now. Sturgeons take a long time to mature, and they don't have high fecundity. You think of a sturgeon as being bursting with eggs when she's spawning, but they skip 2, 3, 4 years between spawning. So their lifetime fecundity between maturing very late and then not spawning every year is not very high. So they're very sensitive to fishing mortality. So the fact that we now have short-nosed sturgeon as the endangered species since the 70s and Atlantic's now threatened or endangered means that we're keeping our hands off them for the most part. And there's very good evidence that Atlantics are coming back pretty strongly. We're seeing them in systems where we thought they were extirpated. And the Hudson River has the world's largest sturgeon population I'm aware of in one system. Has about somewhere around 65, 70,000 short-nosed sturgeon. And this is up from about 15,000 back in the 70s. So I think we have the world's greatest sturgeon recovery of any river, of any species. around the world. So sturgeon are simple. It's just a matter of keeping hands off and letting them do their thing. It's not as complicated as these passage issues are for other species.
I'm going to go down the list there. Andrew Meyer has a question.
What are some commonalities between successful grassroots dam removal groups? What can we do to foster more? What can we do to foster more active? I think it says dam removal groups in New York. I think education. There's some parts of New England that have strong cultures and histories of river herring runs where people would say, "Hey, the herring are in," and people would go flocking to the rivers and take fish to eat or for bait for lobster or just to watch the magic of these rivers run silver. We don't have that same deep history in New York of managing these stocks so actively, but there's a lot of interest in it. And again, I think we need to have grassroots organizations decide that they're going to make this a focal point and start getting out there, spreading the word, start looking at systems where they can maybe effect some change easily. And there's some funding now available through DEC. Fran Dunwell found a little less than $1 million to use for dam removals and fish passage in the Hudson watershed. Right now, there are projects in mind that are not going to help Diadromous fish right away. There are dams that are further inland from the first dam, but even that is a very good thing. Ultimately, we want to see all these river sections reconnected. So there's a lot of potential for New York State. It's just a matter now of coalescing the right group of actors, DEC and NGOs, to work together more fruitfully. But the potential is there and the opportunities are rife. Yes?
So you've argued pretty convincingly that the complexity of these systems is important and can drive resiliency. But if you had to choose, would you choose river miles or a diversity of tributaries? So, and that might translate to just focusing on one tributary that we drive multiple projects through versus trying to get the first dam on a bunch of tributaries.
Interesting question and a tough one. It would depend, I guess, on the degree of each. I would say right now river miles are probably more important. There's so much water that has potential that's closed off, and I think it's easier to gain back river miles than it is to complexify. So in the case of river miles, you take down that one dam, all of a sudden you have X number of miles behind it that's wide open. It could be a lot of miles. In the case of complexification, you're talking about literally manicuring and changing the nature of each piece of that landscape, which is a much more expensive and harder job. So right now I'd settle for river miles. But it's an interesting question.
Another one from Dan there.
Dan asks, one of the most troubling aspects of Diadromous fish declines is the consequences for life history diversity and portfolio effects that confer resilience. We often think about dams and fish passage in terms of population recovery, but what about the evolutionary consequences? Do you think dams could impact the degree of heteroparity for shad and other fishes? Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think there's a huge research vacuum in looking at the long-term selective pressures of utilizing engineered fish passages. And the most tantalizing piece of evidence I found for the importance of this was a run of an Diadromous brown trout in Sweden, I think it was, where they found that over time, the fish ladder selected against large and small individuals. Because the large fish couldn't handle the fish ladder very well because it was too confining, and the small individuals found it just, I guess, too energetic and difficult for them. So over time, the length spectrum of these fish shrunk to a more moderate size, which is a very fast response. And it suggests that there's probably a whole world here of research that needs to be looked at in terms of these questions. But that's not what we've been thinking about in the past. The effort has been mostly towards how do we tweak these passages to make them work better. But I think the evolutionary biologists should jump on this and start looking at these questions. That grant I just mentioned was mentioned here by Andrew Meyer. So if you're interested in perhaps doing your own work in the Hudson watershed, you might want to look at that link and think about a project.
We have two more questions.
It's a great opportunity. Marcy?
I'm just thrilled to hear that you're in favor of dam removal now. And
I've always been.
I'd love to raise money for, this is the kind of pork barrel spending I would strongly support, removing dams.
Yeah.
But usually at Hudson River Foundation, which is habitat loss and destruction by things other than dams, modern things like real estate development projects misplaced in the water. And so I don't really know how to make this a question, but it's interesting to me that you arrived through good scientific scrutiny at dam removal is really important for reviving fisheries.
Yeah, well, this is this is a this is happening across the country. There is a upwelling of interest in this, and it is happening everywhere, but it's not happening in a truly organized fashion. But it is real and it is happening. Unfortunately, as we're doing this in this country, there is a dam building craze going on internationally. There are dams going up on big rivers in South America, Mongolia, Southeast Asia. A lot of developing countries see hydropower as panacea, or at least part of the answer to the energy problem. And there is an international dam building boom. At the same time, we've come to realize that this is not a good idea. And it's just interesting that we're in very different places internationally on the dam question. Meryl?
Yeah, in terms of leveraging the power of the American consumer and our influence on politicians and elected officials. 2 nights ago, I saw such a disturbing video about the fish coming out from Vietnam, where these fish are being reared in raw sewage tanks, basically. And that, when we consider the fact that 90% of our fish is imported, we are really losing our domestic fisheries very rapidly. And I think now, so that our senators are voting on Pacific trade agreement, and I hope we do not increase the amount of fish that are coming from human cesspools where these fish are being reared. And I think we need to use the consumer power and talk to our politicians and reinvest in our local, foodways where we can eat domestic healthy fish.
Yeah.
And so it goes beyond little, our little local issues, but in
Yeah,
fact, national.
I agree. This was this was the basis of Paul Greenberg's recent book, where he noted the interesting conundrum or irony that we import the vast majority of fish that we eat, and we export most of the fish that we catch. It doesn't make any sense.
Well, I mean, we do have opportunities to educate our senators. They do have professional development meetings up in Albany, and I think, we have to.
I think we're done. So anyway, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. There's a lot to think about, John. Thanks so much. Again, I just want to mention May 19th, Ken J. Field from NOAA is going to be talking about PCBs and stripes and fish in the river. So thanks everyone for coming. And if you haven't signed our little sheet, which I'm not sure where it is, it's probably up at the front desk, please do so we can keep track of it. You're getting good. You're getting better, I should say.
Right, yeah. I see you sometimes in the fall walking around.
Right, he was going to come to me, we had a meeting together after this stuff.
I have a question for you.
Online, if everyone wants to.
You're back?